Hello people, how's it going? Let me introduce myself first. I'm not a professional psychologist, but I've been fascinated by human behavior and the darker side of the mind for a long time. While I don't have formal training, I've spent a year and a half studying and working closely with professionals in the field. I've connected with experts across social media platforms and built relationships with some of the top minds in this area. So, why did I start this? It's simple. I realized how powerful understanding human behavior can be, especially the parts people don't like to talk about. The darker aspects, the hidden tactics we use, often without even realizing it. I wanted to take that knowledge and share it, not just with those in my community, but with everyone interested. Whether it's relationships, business, or just daily life, understanding the way people think and what drives them can give you a significant advantage. Anyways, now let's start the main event. Alright everyone. Today we're diving into the deep end of psychology. Dark psychology, to be specific. Now, dark psychology isn't something that gets talked about too often, but it's all around us. In fact, a lot of the manipulation and mind games we're going to cover today, you've probably experienced them, maybe without even realizing it. They're used by advertisers, politicians, your boss, your colleagues, even your so-called friends, no? What is dark psychology? It's the study of the more manipulative, controlling, and often harmful aspects of human behavior. We're talking about the way people use psychological tactics to influence and exploit others. And make no mistake, this is happening every day. So over the next 2 hours, we're going to break it all down. We'll talk about things like perception, how the way we see the world can be twisted to someone else's advantage. We'll explore manipulation and persuasion, and I'll make sure you know the difference between the two. We'll delve into the dark tetrad, a set of personality traits you really need to watch out for. Plus, we'll get into mind games, brainwashing, and all the tactics people use to get inside your head. You ready? Let's get started then. It's going to be quite the journey. Now, first things first, let's talk about perception. You see, perception is at the heart of most manipulative tactics. Why? Because the way you perceive the world isn't necessarily how the world really is. It's a filtered view, and those filters are shaped by your past experiences, your beliefs, and even your emotional state. So if someone can control your perception, they can control your reality, can't they? Think about it like this. Let's say you're in a relationship and your partner keeps telling you that you're forgetful. Every time you bring up something important, they brush it off by saying, "Oh, you're probably just remembering it wrong." Over time, you start to believe them. You question your memory, your own sense of reality. This is called gaslighting, a classic technique that manipulates your perception of what's true and what's not. But perception manipulation isn't always that obvious. Advertisers, for instance, do it all the time. They'll show you an image of someone living a glamorous life. Expensive clothes, fast cars, holidays on a beach somewhere tropical. They're not selling you a product. They're selling you an idea, a perception of how your life could be if you buy what they're offering. And because our perceptions are so easily shaped, many people fall for it. So, how do you spot when your perception's being manipulated? Look for situations where someone's trying to tell you how to interpret reality. Whether it's a situation, an event, or even your own feelings. They're usually not offering you another point of view. They're trying to replace yours with theirs. That's when you know something's up. Persuade and manipulate are two verbs that are often used as synonyms, but which, on the contrary, have very different meanings. As we will see shortly, the difference between persuasion and manipulation lies fundamentally in the techniques and methods used to convince another person. Persuasion is the art of changing someone else's attitude or behavior through a mutual exchange of ideas. Unlike manipulation, it uses only words and logical arguments to put the interlocutor into a specific state of mind to which the persuader points. It can be said that persuasion aims at obtaining approval and trust through a gradual and systematic work of conviction. Persuasion is open, transparent, and relies on logic, facts, and sometimes emotion to convince someone to do something. For example, let's say you're a manager at work, and you want your team to work overtime to hit a deadline. You could lay out the reasons why it's important, how it'll benefit the company, and maybe even offer them a bonus or time off later. You're not hiding anything, you're presenting your argument, and they're free to decide if they want to go along with it, no? The art of persuasion can be compared to a knife. It can be used either to cut a cake or food or to kill a person. Objectively, the knife is not made to be a weapon, but could be used as a weapon. In the same way, also persuasion techniques can be used for both good and ethical purposes, or they can be used for evil purposes. So consider this video as a real knife and learn to use it in the right way. Everything will depend on you. Now, manipulation is a different beast. Manipulation is sneaky. It's about getting someone to do what you want, but without them realizing it. It's covert and often involves deception, omission, or playing on someone's insecurities. Instead of telling your team why working overtime is important, you might start subtly guilt-tripping them. Maybe you say something like, well, if we don't hit this deadline, it's really going to reflect badly on the whole team. Now they're not agreeing because they understand the importance. They're agreeing because you've made them feel like they have no choice. And here's the thing. The person being manipulated often doesn't even realize what's happening. Manipulation works best when it's subtle, almost invisible. And because it's so hard to spot, people can fall victim to it for years without catching on. So how do you spot manipulation when it's happening to you? Well, one big clue is how you feel during the interaction. Manipulation often leaves you feeling confused, guilty, or uncertain. If someone's making you question your own feelings or decisions, that's a red flag. Another thing to look out for is whether you're being given all the information. Manipulators tend to withhold key details or twist the facts to suit their narrative. If you find that you're only being told half the story, or if something just doesn't quite add up, it's worth questioning what's really going on. Finally, check if the person is trying to make you feel responsible for their emotions or actions. This is a classic manipulation tactic. They might say something like, "You're making me feel like this," or "I wouldn't have done that if you hadn't." It's all about shifting the blame onto you, even when it doesn't belong there. Right. Now let's move on to something that's central to dark psychology, the dark tetrad. These are 4 personality traits that are linked to manipulative, exploitative, and often harmful behavior. Now, not everyone who displays these traits is dangerous, but when these traits are taken to the extreme, you've got someone who's capable of causing real harm. For a long time, psychologists have referred to the dark human traits as the dark triad, which consists of 3 negative personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. However, in recent years, many experts in the field have been insisting that garden-variety sadism should also be added to the list of major dark psychological traits. As a result, we are now moving away from the dark triad and toward the 4 dark psychology traits. We encounter instances of narcissism, Machiavellianism, sadism, and non-clinical psychopathy on a regular basis. And if we are keen, we might be able to notice them. Statistically, we all have these traits in us to some extent. In fact, when psychologists test people for these traits, they use testing methods that assume that these traits exist in a spectrum. To take sadism as an example, such tests imply that instead of having people who are sadistic and those who are not sadistic, we have people who have high levels of sadism and those who have low levels of sadism. Another important thing to note is that some of the characteristics that are displayed by people with each of the 4 traits can overlap. And this can be confusing, even for people who have professional training in psychology. For example, narcissists may behave in ways that are similar to Machiavellians or sadists. Because of this, it may be hard to tell what kind of dark trait a person has just by observing them for a short period of time. If someone does something that's detrimental to others, you could be able to tell which dark trait the person has by examining the motivation or the extent of the evil action. Don't jump to conclusions. Take some time to examine the person's behavior closely before you make any judgment. If the person's actions are detrimental to you, it may be hard to stay objective when you are analyzing his dark personality trait, but it's important to remember that you can only appropriately deal with people if you have a good understanding of their traits and motivations. You can try to remove yourself from the situation and analyze the person as an objective, third-party observer. Let's start with Machiavellianism. People high in Machiavellianism are strategic, calculated, and often manipulative. They're always thinking a few steps ahead, and they're more than willing to bend the rules to get what they want. It's not that they're inherently evil, they just believe that the end justifies the means. A Machiavellian person won't hesitate to lie, cheat, or manipulate to achieve their goals. They're excellent at wearing masks. They'll pretend to be your best mate while secretly undermining you behind the scenes. An example of a Machiavellian? Think of a politician who makes all the right promises during an election, only to do the opposite once they're in power. They knew all along that they weren't going to follow through, but they said what they needed to say to get what they wanted. How to spot them? Machiavellians are often very charming and persuasive, but if you pay close attention, you'll notice they're always angling for something. Their friendships and relationships tend to be transactional. They're only in it for as long as they're getting something out of it. They're also good at keeping their true intentions hidden. Weakness. Machiavellians thrive on control. If you can spot their manipulative tactics early and refuse to play along, they lose their power. They hate it when people see through their game. Now, let's talk about narcissism. Narcissists have an inflated sense of their own importance. They believe they're special, unique, and deserving of admiration. They crave attention and validation, and they're often willing to go to great lengths to get it. A narcissist is that person in your life who always seems to make everything about themselves, no matter the situation. If you try to share a story, they'll interrupt and say, "That reminds me of the time I..." An example of a narcissist might be a boss who takes credit for your work. They're the type who loves to bask in praise and will happily claim all the glory, even if they had little to do with the success. But when things go wrong, they're nowhere to be found. How to spot them? Narcissists are often charming at first, but their need for constant admiration soon becomes apparent. They have little patience for criticism and will react poorly if they feel their ego is being threatened. You'll also notice that they struggle with empathy. They have a hard time understanding or caring about the feelings of others. Weakness. A narcissist's greatest weakness is their ego. If you stop feeding their need for validation or call them out on their behavior, they'll often lash out or crumble. Criticism, even when it's constructive, is something they can't handle. Psychopathy. Now on to psychopathy. Psychopaths are different from the rest because they lack empathy, that ability to feel what others are feeling. This makes them incredibly dangerous, as they're not bound by the same moral or emotional constraints that most people have. Psychopaths are cold, calculating, and often charming. They can be charismatic, but underneath, there's a complete lack of remorse or guilt for their actions. A classic example of a psychopath is the corporate executive who lays off hundreds of employees without a second thought just to increase profits. They might seem calm, composed, even friendly, but they're ruthless when it comes to getting what they want. How to spot them? Psychopaths are often thrill seekers and tend to live in the moment without much regard for the future. They're also excellent liars and can be incredibly persuasive. You'll often notice that they remain eerily calm, even in high-stress situations where most people would panic. Weakness. Psychopaths are impulsive. Because they don't feel empathy, they don't consider the emotional fallout of their actions. This often leads them to make reckless decisions that eventually come back to bite them. Sadism. Finally, we come to sadism. Sadists are the darkest of the dark. Unlike the other traits where manipulation or power might be the goal, sadists enjoy causing pain and suffering. It's not just about control for them, it's about the pleasure they get from making others suffer. You'll often find sadists in positions where they have power over others, like a manager who bullies their employees just because they can. How to spot them? Sadists go out of their way to hurt others, even when there's no real gain for them. They might make cruel jokes or belittle people in front of others, and they seem to genuinely enjoy watching others squirm. They're often the ones who seem to have a bit too much fun when someone else is in a bad spot. Weakness. Sadists rely on their ability to dominate others. If you stand up to them or refuse to react to their cruelty, it throws them off. They're not used to being challenged, and they often don't know how to handle it. Alright, now we know about the big four, let's talk about some other dark personalities. These are not like the old ones, but not as natural as a normal person. Let's start with sociopathy, another key trait that often comes up in discussions of dark psychology. Sociopaths, like psychopaths, have little regard for the rules of society and the feelings of others. But there's a key difference between a sociopath and a psychopath, and that's where things get interesting. You see, while psychopaths tend to be cold, calculating, and meticulous, sociopaths are much more chaotic and impulsive. They're often driven by emotional outbursts, and they lack the careful planning that's so common in psychopathy. Imagine someone who doesn't follow the law, doesn't care about social norms, and acts purely based on their own desires. That's your typical sociopath. They're not necessarily evil, but they don't play by the same rules the rest of us do. A sociopath's behavior tends to be reckless and erratic. They might lash out violently in a moment of anger, without thinking through the consequences. Where psychopaths can be charming and calm, sociopaths are more likely to struggle with fitting in. They tend to have trouble maintaining stable relationships, jobs, or even staying out of trouble with the law. They're impulsive, and because they lack empathy, they don't see why they should follow the rules that keep the rest of us in line. Now, sociopaths can be a bit tricky to spot at first because, in the right situations, they can seem quite normal. But there are telltale signs. One of the clearest indicators is their inability to maintain stable relationships. Sociopaths tend to leave a trail of broken friendships, failed relationships, and burned bridges behind them. They simply don't care about the long-term consequences of their actions. Sociopaths, despite their bold and often aggressive nature, have clear weaknesses. The biggest one is their impulsiveness. Because they don't plan ahead and act on a whim, they often get caught in their own traps. Where a psychopath might carefully cover their tracks, a sociopath will act in the heat of the moment, making reckless choices that can come back to haunt them. Another major weakness is their emotional instability. Sociopaths are prone to fits of rage and frustration when things don't go their way. This emotional volatility can lead to their downfall, as their outbursts often alienate even those who might have been on their side. If you're able to stay calm and composed while they're losing control, you've got the upper hand. Now let me introduce another thing called eye predators. Eye predators are people or groups of people who use modern technology to prey on others, either directly or indirectly. As we have mentioned, everyone has a dark side, and the anonymity that the internet offers has a way of bringing out that dark side in many of us. The result is that there is an ever-increasing number of people who are looking to exploit, coerce, stalk, and victimize others online, and through the use of other technological tools. These predators seem to be driven by deviant fantasies, which they feel free to play out, because the internet makes it possible for them to lurk in the shadows. In other words, they are not restricted by the usual social norms that keep people from revealing their dark side because no one online knows their real identities. These people tend to have all sorts of prejudices and preconceptions, which they go to great lengths to impose on others. Eye predators come in different shapes and sizes. There are stalkers, harassers, criminals, perverts, terrorists, bullies, con men, and even trolls. No matter what kind of predators they are, they all tend to have a self-awareness of the fact that they are harming others. They also tend to go out of their way to cover their tracks, which means they don't want the people who know them in real life to discover that they have a dark side. Another one, arson, is also a different manifestation of dark psychology. Arsonists are people who tend to be obsessively preoccupied with setting fires. Some of them become serial arsonists. They set fires regularly and in a manner that is highly ritualistic. Necrophiliacs are people who are sexually interested in the dead, while serial killers are people who murder 3 or more people over a prolonged period of time. These are some of the most extreme manifestations of dark psychology, and although they are rare, they are still worth discussing if you want to understand dark psychology. Experts in the field of criminal psychology believe that serial killers and other evildoers are motivated by the pursuit of psychological gratification, which they can only achieve by performing those brutal acts. To the people who perform the worst kinds of evil acts, those acts are like drugs to them. They are addictive, in a way. For instance, when a serial killer gets some form of gratification from murdering someone, he may feel the urge to do it again in order to experience the same gratification. For today we are done here. Next up, I will talk another topic, and of course we will discuss manipulation techniques, as well as other things. Kindly don't text an ebook GC and resources GC. I will see you soon. Till then, have good time and stay connected to dark psychology.